In this video, we are going to look at the 5 habits Magnus Carlsen uses to be the best chess player in the world. And these are habits that all of us can include in our own games to become stronger players. This is going to be very educational and very informative. The 5 habits Magnus Carlsen uses to be the strongest chess player in the world. Let's begin with our game through which we're going to view all 5 of these habits. It's a game Stellan Brynell versus Magnus Carlsen. And this was played in 05. So Magnus was a younger player, but he was rated 2570 already at this point, and his habits were very clear. Magnus has black, Stellan Brynell white, d4, d5, c4, c6. This is the Slav defense. Basically, black is trying to create a strong point on d5 while leaving this bishop at c8 unblocked. That's the idea behind the Slav. Knight to c3, knight f6, e3. And here, Magnus plays e6. Now, in the past, he had played a6, and this is when we come to the first habit of Magnus Carlsen that we can implement into our own games, and that is Magnus plays many, many different openings. Before Magnus's time, someone like Fischer, for example, Bobby Fischer, always played the same opening. He rarely deviated. If you played e4 against Fischer, you know he was going to play a Sicilian Najdorf. If you played d4, you know he played the King's Indian. e4, e5, it would be a Spanish, and on and on and on. Kasparov as well. He did change at one point simply because his openings weren't working, but they would always play the same thing when you sat down. Well, when a player sits down to play Magnus, you have no idea what he is going to play. And he may not know the openings quite as deeply as those players, but his opening repertoire is so wide that it gives him a big advantage because there's simply no way you can prepare an opening trap against Magnus because he plays too many things. You just don't know what he's going to play. So the first habit, the first chess habit of Magnus Carlsen that we can implement is to have a very broad opening repertoire so people don't know what you're going to play when you sit down. Knight f3, after e6, knight f3 was played by Grandmaster Brynell. Knight b to d7, bishop to d3. We now have what's called a semi-Slav opening. Magnus takes on c4. And in this position, what black basically tries to do is either to play e5 or c5, because white has a space advantage with this d4 pawn. So he wants to basically liquidate that pawn so that white's space advantage goes away, or isolate it, one or the other. But the first move played is b5. He's gaining a tempo, Magnus is, against this bishop on c4, and he wants to develop his own bishop from b7 onto this long diagonal. The most aggressive move for white here is bishop to d3, but in this game, white plays bishop to e2. He doesn't want this bishop to become a target. He wants to preserve it. And spoiler alert, that bishop lasts the entire game. So in that sense, it was a successful decision. Bishop to b7. He would love to play c5, open up that diagonal. The b5 pawn would hang at the moment after c5, but that's the idea. With this bishop castles, bishop to e7, and now e4. White creates a full pawn center, which is something of an ideal structure in chess. So Magnus has to take immediate action. He plays b4. Basically, he kicks the knight away. That is the defense of the e4 pawn. And if the knight just moves, Magnus will just take the e4 pawn and be winning. So what white does instead is counterattacks with the move e5, attacking that knight on f6, pawn takes knight, and here Magnus plays bishop f6. The reason is he wants to leave this knight on d7 to support that c5 push we've been talking about. Also, by taking with the bishop and leaving the knight on d7, there's no queen to a4 check idea later because the knight blocks that diagonal. Pawn takes, and now c5. Magnus gets in that key pawn push, attacking the center. dc5. And here, Magnus could take on c5, but after the exchange of queens, this is really a dead equal position, and it's harder for black to find winning chances. So in order to keep the position a little more complicated, Magnus decides to castle first. The pawn on c5 is obviously still quite vulnerable and isn't going anywhere. But the white player defends it with bishop to a3. Magnus attacks it with bishop to e7. Obviously, it's attacked twice now, defended once. So queen to d4 adds a second defender. Queen to c7 adds a third attacker. Everything's revolving around this c5 square for the moment. Rook A to B1, that indirectly defends this pawn by attacking the bishop at B7. For example, if black tried to take it now, then after bishop C5, rook takes B7, because this counterattacks the queen, it would win material. And if black tried to interpose, bishop takes F3 first, then just bishop E7, bishop E2, then bishop to F8. And white actually threatens mate on G7. And so black would have to take that bishop, and after rook E1, as you can see, white would be up and exchange. So that indirectly defends the pawn. So Magnus plays bishop to C6, blockading the pawn and preserving the bishop. Queen to E3. The idea here for white is to move the knight into D4, centralize it so it can control all those key squares and attack C6, for example, as well. So this brings us to habit number 2, and that is that Magnus Carlsen always seeks to gain small advantages. His main goal is not to checkmate his opponent in the first 10 or 15 moves. His opponents are too good. They're the best of the best. You're not going to get games like that, those types of miniatures, against those players. So what he does is he accumulates very small advantages, one after the other, and they add up over time to become a very large advantage. In this position, seeing that the knight's going to land on D4, he plays bishop takes knight, and he sees that this variation will lead to a particular position, one with opposite colored bishops, but one where he has all the winning chances himself. So his second habit is to accumulate as many small, even tiny advantages as he possibly can. Bishop takes F3, the rook moves. Now C6, obviously that attacks the knight, but also offers the trade of bishops. So bishop takes A3, CD7, queen D7, and C4. So white has these split pawns here at A2 and C4, and this pawn on C4 is a weakness. But if it could make its way to the C6 square, defended by this bishop on F3, white would actually have the advantage. So it's important for Magnus to control this C5 square, which is his ideal landing spot for this bishop at A3. So the queen goes to E7 to help control that C5 square. Rook to B5, white wants to control it with the rook, but then Magnus goes ahead and takes that rook. And now it does unsplit these pawns. They're no longer isolated, but Magnus knows the real battle is between these bishops, and he wants that square on C5 for his. Rook to D8, rook to D1, the rooks come off. Queen to D6 threatens the bishop on D1. The bishop goes back to F3, and now bishop to C5. A key idea with tempo, hitting the queen. He wants to place this bishop on this long diagonal. With opposite colored bishops, they're more drawish in the endgame, but here it's actually an advantage for black because his bishop has a target he can attack, in this case the F2 pawn, and white cannot defend it with his own bishop, and white doesn't have the same kind of spot to attack in black's position. Queen moves, queen to D4, threatening queen to A1 check and picking up the A2 pawn. So G3 gives white's king some room to move. G6, king G2, the king is centralized. Bishop to C6, now bishop to B6, locking that bishop in place, making it really hard, if not impossible, to get rid of on that diagonal. Now, here we come to habit number 3 of Magnus's chess play. Magnus plays what we would call anti-computer chess. We talked about how he plays different openings, but also he plays very positional chess, less concrete. Now, he can play concrete chess if he wants to. He can calculate with the best of them. We know that, but he plays a type of chess that it's harder for computers to win at. Now, as time has gone on, computers have become so massively strong. That's not as true as it used to be. We know that computers are positionally now also untouchable. But when he first became a grandmaster, that wasn't really true. Computers could calculate brilliantly, but they weren't as good positionally. And so he plays anti-computer chess. It's very hard to prepare for him using a computer. With his more positional approach to the game, it's a much more human style of play. And that has led, I think, to a lot of success for him. So habit number 3, Magnus plays anti-computer chess, more positional, a variety of openings. And in this position, we can see how strong black's attack is on white's F2 pawn. And if you put this in a computer, it says it's dead equal. But is it really? I don't think so. F5, he begins to advance his pawn majority. Queen to E2, E5, bishop B7, and E4. And we see this really strong pawn chain from Magnus. And computers still see this as equal. But again, it's anti-computer chess. So for a human, this is not equal at all. Magnus has a clear advantage with this nice pawn chain. Bishop to C6, king to F6, centralizing his king in the endgame. You can see White can't do much but move his bishop back and forth. King to E5, bishop to C6, G5. I can't think of any human that would want White's position. Bishop to B7, and now G4, creating a clamp on this square. Bishop to C6 and H5. Magnus continues to grab more and more space with each move, a slight positional increase. And this H-pawn can become a real problem for White. In fact, again, put this into a computer, it thinks White is fine, but in fact, White only really has one move to maintain equality here, and it's very hard to find move H4. The idea is after you take en passant, king takes, and you take on F2, Black wins a pawn, but after queen C4, the queen threatens to deliver a lot of irritating checks, so queens come off, and in the pure bishop endgame, Black should be able to hold a draw here, even a pawn down, but it's very hard to find those moves as White. So instead, he plays a more natural bishop to E8, and now after H4, Magnus is really putting on serious pressure, and we come to habit number 4. Magnus Carlsen makes endgames his top priority. He is, I don't think anyone disputes this anymore, the greatest endgame player the game has ever seen. And before he became a champion, there was an endgame principle. In fact, it's even in Mikhail Shereshevsky's endgame strategy book called The Principle of Two Weaknesses. That is, if you had an advantage and you wanted to trade into an endgame, you needed to make sure that your opponent had two weaknesses you could work on, so you could alternate back and forth between the two weaknesses to win the game. Well, with Magnus, he was only creating one weakness, but his endgame skill was so great, he was still beating players rated over 2,700 in the endgame because he always made the endgame a top priority. He kept the end in mind. So habit number 4 for Magnus was to make the endgame a top priority and become as strong in the endgame as he possibly could. His endgame skills are astonishing. The queen goes to E1, H3 check, king to G1, and just look at this. He's got a dark squared bishop, and along with his queen, they control the dark squares, but look, his pawns control all of the light squares. So he has everything covered. The dark squares with the pieces, the light squares with the pawns. This is just a beautiful construction of chess. The queen goes to B2, attacking the A2 pawn and keeping pressure on F2. Bishop to C6 was played. If he plays A4 to try to save the pawn, then Magnus could play this very strong move, bishop to A5, posting the bishop very aggressively. And the bishop cannot be taken because queen C1 would end up with a back rank mate. You can only block it once, and that's mate because this H3 pawn creates that back rank position. Queen takes A2, bishop B7, queen to B2, bishop C6, bishop D4, bishop to E8, and now E3. Trying to open up this position. White obviously cannot take the pawn because of this move. Queen to G2, checkmate. So he plays king to F1 instead. Now this pawn at E3 is pinned, so Magnus steps out of the pin. King to F6, queen to E2, and queen to C1 check. Queen E1, and he takes the queens off the board. EF2 check, king to F1. And now we come to habit number 5 of Magnus's chess. He never quits. He presses and presses and presses. Before Magnus came along, there was something called the Grandmaster draw, where Grandmasters would just decide to have a draw in a moderately maybe complex endgame, and they would just say, we're good enough. We know this will be drawn anyway, and they would go have a beer together. Magnus said, I'm staying at the board, and I'm going to press and press and press and press, and I'm going to make you work and work and work and work and work. He never quit. He did not accept those easy Grandmaster draws. He pushed and pushed and pushed, and he made everybody else start pushing. They were getting lazy, and he really showed them you can't stop at chess. So habit 5 is he rejected the concept of the Grandmaster draw and pushed and fought till the bitter end. F4, GF4, King F5, Bishop F7, King F4. Now, in this position, White resigned, but it's a little hard to see why. So let's look at that very quickly. The winning process goes something like this. Bishop to d5. He's got to control this h1 square, so when black breaks through, he can't queen there. g3, hg3, king g3. Bishop goes to h1. Now the king moves back to the queen side. That's the key idea for black. h2, and you see this pawn is one square away from queening, so the bishop has to stay on this diagonal. Bishop h1, king to c5, and there's nothing he can do to prevent black from munching on that b5 pawn. In this position, with 3 passed pawns, white would be lost. So that is why he resigned in the last position. I hope you found this video revealing and educational. I hope you're able to implement some of these habits into your play. Maybe we can't play them as well as Magnus does, but they can make us better chess players. See you again soon at Chess Talk. Goodbye.